basically, it just comes down to telling a story. That's what it is. If there is an explanation for what happened and why, and your borrower can relay that to you, you relay it to us.
Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Helping Heroes Become Homeowners. I'm your podcast host, Richard Sarey with Alliance Mortgage Group. Again, this podcast is helping veterans and active duty members learn more about their benefit and debunking those loan myths that you hear out there, that the VA home loan isn't the best loan out there. So today I have a special guest, a VA Underwriter, Jami Kennedy. Jami is passionate about the VA home loan, just like I am. So I'm excited to have her on, get some feedback from her, some underwriting tips from the VA aspects of lending. Jami, welcome. I appreciate you being on. Can you tell us a little bit about your background as a VA underwriter?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I started in mortgage in May of 2009, I believe. I started a little backwards. Most people dive into conventional first. I actually dove into VA first. I worked for the California Department of Veterans Affairs, so I dabbled in CalVet home loans, but majority were VA loans. So I probably worked with VA for 4 or 5 years before I ever touched a conventional file. So VA is definitely my wheelhouse. It's where my passion is. I love helping veterans. So that's a little bit about me.
With being VA underwriter, you have to get certain certifications to be designated, correct?
Absolutely. So it depends. If you go through the automated service, which most lenders and brokers do, then you do. At working for the California Department of Veterans Affairs, all of our loans were manual underwrites. I never ran a loan through AUS. So I didn't have to have my lab. I wasn't a SAR. We had designated SARs at the time. So it wasn't until I went over to the private industry that I actually got my certification, and which was a little bit easier because you're running through things through AUS. You're getting the automated approval, which kind of is a little bit more lenient than the manual underwrite and what's required.
Absolutely. So that's a good point that you bring up, manual underwrites. So tell us a little bit about what that process looks like from a VA underwriter standpoint, and what tips can you give maybe the loan officer out there who's not familiar with how to do a manual underwrite?
Manual underwrites, I would say there's two big differences. One is the documentation you need. You're going to need 2 months bank statements, whereas an automated, you only need 1 month bank statement. You're going to need every type of credit, LOE or LOX, whatever you call it, for drogs, any lates, where an automated, you don't necessarily need that. You need to look at the credit a little bit more in depth. So if you have recent collections, charge-offs, it's treated a little bit differently on a manual underwrite than on an automated approval. You have to dig deeper into that. You really need to make sure they have at least 12 months satisfactory credit. Are their collections, a one-off, a one-time thing? It's just definitely more documentation, and looking at that credit piece is the big differences.
So with the credit piece on the explanation letters, are you looking for the last 12 months derogatory credit, 24 months? How far back are we looking that we need explanation letters for?
So on manual underwrites, it really depends. We all know if you're a VA underwriter, VA lender, the guides aren't very black and white. There's all those gray areas. Right. So if it's really going to depend. If you look at it and they have collections from a year ago that started 5 years ago, so let's just say they had something happened to them for a 5-year period, you're going to want an explanation for all of that. But if they have 2 collections last year and then maybe a collection a few years prior to that, you're just going to want an explanation for the most recent.
Okay. So have you found that most military have explanations tying them to their service time when they get redeployed, or things that are sometimes really out of their control? Is there more leniency on those, or walk me through what's where you're comfortable versus not comfortable, because you're putting your name on that approval at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Basically, it just comes down to telling a story. That's what it is. If there is an explanation for what happened and why, and your borrower can relay that to you, you relay it to us. As an underwriter, it's really important that you put those notes on your VA loan analysis. You don't want to just submit a package. So that's where we come into play. We have to have the whole story on these VA loans. With conventional, it's not as important. With these, it is, because if you can tell that story to VA and you can justify what I'm doing as an underwriter, then they're more than likely going to be okay with it. They trust us as an underwriter, but you have to be able to explain why you're doing what you're doing.
Absolutely. What do you think, in your thousands of loans that you've underwritten, what's been not really the craziest, but maybe from a loan officer perspective, the most unlikely scenario that's gotten through?
I have actually, I came from retail. That's where I was for years. I dabbled a little bit in wholesale. So it's a lot different as far as a lender goes. You have more wiggle room on the retail side, I think, than you do on the wholesale side. But I have actually approved loans that were like 63, 65 DTI, which just blew my mind.
On a manual underwrite?
No, on an AUS approved underwrite.
Oh yeah, I've gotten those too. Yes, they got the residual
it's all about
income,
the residual,
right? Yeah,
right. And then it goes back to your lender overlays. Like, I have gone up to 58, 59 on a manual on my retail when I was in the retail world, because we can make those calls. It made sense. The borrowers, they had reserves, they had good income. I mean, their credit was a little off, but they had a BK a few years prior. They were clean ever since, and just for whatever reason, we could not get an AUS approval, but everything else made sense. And again, it's like I said, it's telling that story. As an underwriter, you have to be able to tell that story on your loan analysis to make it make sense. And then VA is not going to question you. As long as your residual, when you're over a 41% DTI, you meet residual by 120%, and you have stable income, you can show that they have satisfactory credit, they're going to make the loan work.
Right. And that you have underwriting authority when it comes to that. Correct.
Absolutely.
Yes. You don't have to ask anyone for their 2 cents. Complete authority.
No.
So with that being said, what's the likelihood of the approval rate for VA home loans versus maybe conventional or FHA? Because I have the numbers. I'm curious to know if you, with your experience, if you know that VA probably has a higher approval rate than other lenders or other financing.
I would assume they do, just because how high you can go up for the DTI. And I really think one of the things that helps the VA is their residual calculation. I think having that in there to show, they're taking your paycheck, deducting all of your estimated taxes, seeing what you actually have left over at the end of the month to pay all your bills. So even though it's a higher DTI, when you can see that they meet the residual by 2 or 3 times, they have that ability to pay their bills.
Yep.
And you don't do that with any other type of loan program. I know FHA, I believe, requires you to do that for different scenarios, but not like VA.
Right. With FHA, is if you're at a certain criteria on credit score, I believe, and ratios and all that. So yeah, that comes. Why that's not done on every single financing type is odd, but VA gives you that opportunity to use it to their full advantage to get the approval on that. Now, when it comes to that residual word, you have to have 120%. But and I'll go back to a scenario that I have years ago, like 8-9 years ago, when I first really started diving into the VA platform, is when we have a non-purchasing spouse. We have to take, in the property state, we have to take their debt into consideration, right? And that residual may not be met, but what I learned was we can take the income from that non-purchasing spouse or that other person and use that to offset the residual to help that, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot of people I don't know if they don't realize it or if they're scared to utilize that. But if you're hitting them with the debts, you're not using them to qualify. If they have the income, use the income to offset those debts. If it's in your favor, I mean, if you don't need to use the income, then obviously, by all means, less paperwork is better. But it's
Right.
a tool you can utilize.
Yeah.
And I've done it.
That was, yep. That was one of the first things that I learned because my underwriter's like, why aren't you doing this? I'm like, I didn't know. And
Mm-hmm.
that is like the main guideline in my head forever now is learning that, coming across that and knowing that is a huge way to fix a loan and thinking that through that you can use that additional income to get that residual to work.
Absolutely, because most of the time in community property states, when you're not utilizing the spouse, it's because credit score. You're going to get a better rate
Correct.
if that spouse. But if you have to hit them with the debts, then you might as well throw that income in there.
Absolutely.
They're still technically not on the loan, so that score is not going to impact them. So use everything to your advantage if you need it.
Correct. Because that goes into the household income calculation for that purpose only.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Are there any other unique ways to get the residual down besides what we just discussed on that?
Goodness.
Because I have one that just popped into my head.
I'm sure I have. I mean, so there actually is. So if you have, and it's a single veteran, but if they have a dependent and you're going to hit them for having that dependent for residual income, there is a way that you can either show that they have that dependent 50-50. So you can decrease, that second dependence. It's a unique way to do it. It's all on the underwriter. You have to go in there and like manually switch what is required. You have to make notes on to why you're doing what you're doing. You have to have supporting documentation, which could be, divorce decree shows that my veteran has the dependent 50% of the time, or they paid child. So, whatever the unique situation is, but there is a way to decrease the required residual that way.
That is very out of the box thinking. And
it is.
It's, it comes down to the VA underwriter that you're working with and the experience that the loan officer has maybe in that situation to even come across that thought, to put that loan together. Having that complete conversation with your client. Hey, getting the whole story, like you mentioned about the manual underwrite, get the whole story about the client to see what could and could not work. Now, one other idea that I did 2 months ago was we had seller concessions, and those seller concessions were used to pay down his debt, and that got his residual. That got his residual down. My realtor did not know we could do that on a VA home loan, so that is something new that she learned about using
that is one of the nice things about VAs is that you can use that seller credit as long as it doesn't, as long as how they word the credit, because I've had it worded before that it is, only fees associated with the loan. And I'm not sure why, but as long as it says there's no caveat in there that it can only be used for loan type of fees, you can use it to pay off anything. You can use it to pay down debt. And then
we paid off $18,000 of debt.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah, they came out amazing. They came out debt free in all their debt, and all they had left was the new mortgage payment on the house they bought.
That's amazing.
So it was a complete win-win for both sides. Sellers still netted out what they wanted to net out, and they got their debt pay. I mean, it was.
And you're not leaving seller credit on the table.
What's that?
I said, and you're not leaving seller credit on the table because that's horrible.
No, it was fully used.
That's awesome.
So yeah, that was a really good thing. Now, when we talk about residual income too, there's different requirements for what area of the country that you're in too, correct?
Absolutely. So there is a chart on the VA Lender's Handbook. I, um, when I underwrite, I just keep it on my desktop. I've printed it in a Word doc because it depends on if you're Midwest, South, how many people in your family, the sales price. I am shocked that VA has not increased these figures over the last how many years, but hey,
Yeah.
we'll take what we can get. You also have to include maintenance. So maintenance still is, I think, 0.14 cents per square foot of the home. So you have to take that into consideration. I'm trying to think. I mean, that's pretty much it. There's two big things that would come across my desk. We would have loans with high DTI that would get AUS approval, but they were false findings because when it was submitted, residual calculation wasn't completed. So
Right.
when it hits the
Right.
underwriter's desk, you're like, oh, yeah, they actually they actually don't meet residual, or they meet it, but by this, and then once maybe by an extra $100, not the 3,000 that AUS thought they had, and then
Right.
you rerun it, and now you have refer findings. The other thing is grossing up non-taxable income. You can only gross that up for DTI purposes. You cannot gross that up for
Yes.
residual, and people forget to take the difference and subtract that from the actual residual income. So those are
Yeah.
I think the two big
What's
ones.
really cool about our new origination system that we went to first of the year is there's an actual section built into their system that forces you to fill that out, and it
That's
forces you to
nice.
get the accurate calculation before you run it. So it's because in the past you would have to remember when you go in the DU, did I
Mm-hmm.
do any of that?
Right.
And you get some loan officers that they'll do one or two VA loans a quarter, and they don't put it together properly, and then run into
Mm-hmm.
issues. So the system is built towards making sure that gets filled out. So that's a huge savings grace when it comes to putting a loan through and making sure it's done
Absolutely.
accurately.
Yeah, that
Now,
is nice.
one of the other myths that we come across is appraisals. So it may not be the best question to ask you, but is there a difference between a VA appraisal and an FHA appraisal or conventional appraisal?
I'm not too familiar with FHA. Uh, they've always kept me in VA. I know, honestly, really, no, as far as VA and conventional. So I'm going to say no for FHA because I know an FHA can be transferred to conventional. There really isn't. They have to look for the MPRs, which any good appraiser is going to look for that type of stuff on a conventional appraisal.
And
It's
NPRs
You're
are minimum
subject.
property requirements,
Yes,
right?
sorry.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And your subject to items are going to be the same from conventional to VA. They're not out there looking for things that are wrong with the property, which I know a lot of people seem to think that's the case. And there's actually, I'm not sure people are aware of this, but if there are subject to items that are not health and safety items, you could put in a request to have those waived. And VA does grant those requests sometimes.
Right. So for everyone listening out there, when you want to submit that waiver, do I go through the underwriter? Or do I have to go directly to VA?
You go directly through VA. At least that's how we did it. I think it depends on who your lender is. The NOV has to be issued first before you
Right.
put in that request. So once the notice of value has been issued, then you can put that request in. And the most recent one I had, I think it took them like 24 hours, and they approved it.
Yeah, I had one on a new build. They still had I guess the builder door, not the actual door that the customer purchased.
Oh, right.
I mean, something like that should be a no-brainer. But if there's other things, I had one for a particular appliance. They had the wrong microwave that she picked out, but they put one in there just to have,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm sorry, there was no microwave in there. So something
Okay.
like that for an appliance,
Right.
that got taken care of. When you have value, though, I've had a lot of realtors, tell you, well, the values for VA are going to be different and lower than if we go conventional. And that just, it floors me when I hear that, because your VA appraiser is certified to do VA appraisals, right? They have to go through a certification process to even do those. So have you seen, maybe a hard question to ask, but I don't think that there's going to be a value difference to a large magnitude between a conventional appraisal and a VA appraisal.
Well, there shouldn't be. They should be
There
analyzing the
shouldn't be.
properties the same exact way.
Right.
So that is definitely a myth.
Yes.
And again, there goes to, the one nice thing about VA is you're working with your VA underwriter and you're working with VA. You don't have to go through an AMC. So if you get a value that you're just like, there's no way, like this house should be $25,000 higher in value, and they call Tidewater, same thing. Your underwriter has to go in there. We have to review the appraisal. We have to issue the notice of value. Then you submit a reconsideration of a value to VA. You basically do your own comp grid, tell them why you think it's this value. And it's a toss up. I've had them come back and say, yeah, no, you're stretching. I've also had them come back and increase the value. And there's nothing that needs to be done by the appraiser at this point. VA handles it.
And the max I believe that they can do is what, 10% of the appraisal value?
I actually had one that was a little bit higher, but it's because VA did it. I think what you're thinking of is supposedly the SARs have the authority to
Maybe that's
sway that value, which I have never done that. I have never worked for a lender that will allow us to do that. If they want the value reconsidered, we just go to VA.
So with VA, we have two shots to get our value to match the purchase price. We have the Tidewater that the appraiser is going to give notice. You got 48 hours to do your things, get the appraisal comps to the appraiser, and he'll review. Now, if you ignore that, right, nothing's going to change. You're just going to get it assigned out to VA portal. You pull it down, and it is what it is. Then you'd have to do the reconsideration of value on that.
Absolutely.
And I believe the request has to come from not only us, but also the buyer, the veteran.
The veteran, correct. Because they don't want to increase the value if it's truly not there, or if the veteran doesn't feel it's there. If they don't want to pay that higher price and they think the value is accurate, which makes sense.
Sure.
You want to do what's in their best interest and what they want.
In theory, having a VA appraisal is better than a conventional or FHA.
I think so.
Because you have two chances to counter a low value. I know with conventional, you can rebut, but I've never seen a conventional appraisal rebuttal ever come back at any additional value to match the list price.
Well, and the nice thing about VA as an underwriter, I can talk to the appraiser. On conventional, I am not allowed to talk to the appraiser.
Yeah, so
I talk to the loan officer, the processor, and then they go through the AMC, and then things don't always get portrayed correctly. So you're playing that telephone game.
Right. Yeah, we've had only a few that we've had to do an ROV on, and one came back no, and one came back a little bit higher, but for the most part, it gives us that option. And those are the discussions that we have with the realtors when they're asking us all these questions about value. If we don't get the value, here are two options that we're going to have ahead of time. So it at least gives them a peace of mind that if we don't get there, we have some options in our back pocket.
Right.
So appraisal turn times. I know VA has a particular time frame from acceptance. I believe it's still 10 days, 10 business days, depending on.
For most areas, there are a few areas that are a little less, but yeah, for the majority, it's 10 days.
10
days usually doesn't take that long, though. Correct.
No, not now, but you also had that other theory that they take forever to get back in. Well, no.
Yeah,
they're held to a higher standard. They have to get it back by a certain amount of days per VA.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk real quick too about self-employed complex situations for
Hmm.
veterans, active duty, not too much, but for veterans who maybe are self-employed, is there any special way to get that income evaluated, or is it evaluated the same way with the other types of financing?
It's a little bit different if you are looking at Schedule C. I mean, you have to have 2 years. Where conventional, sometimes you can get away with 1 year. So sometimes that's not in your favor. But when you're looking at Schedule C, a lot of people think that you can add back mileage on VA loans, and you cannot. And I've actually
Okay.
had that be a deal breaker on a couple loans, where they're trying to push out. In all honesty, these people probably should have waited to buy a house. They weren't quite ready yet.
Mm-hmm.
But because they used that mileage, and it was a ridiculous amount. And I was like, yeah, no, VA does not allow you to add mileage back in. Now, if their CPA does it where they're adding the mileage back into depreciation and it's on that depreciation line, of course, you can add back depreciation, but you cannot do the individual line item for mileage. So that's probably one of the biggest differences. Everything else is pretty much calculated the same. If you have a decrease in income, you're going to want an explanation. But again, as long as everything makes sense, VA is really about the storytelling.
Right. What about you have that uniqueness where you may have one person who's going from one job to another, or I don't know, they've got commission on a previous job, they started a new job,
Mm-hmm.
and they have commission too. Is there any leniency on using that commission with how
So
the
there is.
guidelines read?
So the guidelines read that they have to have a 2-year history.
Right.
It doesn't state that it has to be a 2-year history with the same employer. So as long as you can show, and that's where you have to get written VOEs, verification of employment, that actually break down that income for their prior employer to show, what that commission was. So as long as you can show that they have a history of it and it's in line or similar, you can absolutely, same with overtime bonus.
Okay.
It's just all about that documentation.
So if we can show a pattern or a history of it,
Mm-hmm.
we can still average it, or we just take the year-to-date average
Absolutely.
of the new
Well,
job.
I would take the year-to-date average of the new job, or some jobs have, depending. I know there's some car salesmen out there where they get a minimum commission.
Yep.
You can use that as long as you have that supporting documentation. If you have their job offer or their pay agreement that shows exactly how it's paid, then you can use those figures.
So let's talk real quick for active duty. So when you have an active
Mm-hmm.
duty member that wants to purchase a home and they're getting housing allowance, can they use that housing allowance still to purchase a property?
Absolutely. And you can gross it up.
What would be their benefit of doing that?
Using their housing allowance, it gives them more income. So then their debt to income ratio is better. They could probably qualify for more.
So the housing allowance that they get doesn't mean they have to remain on base. They can use the housing allowance to purchase a property. Okay.
Correct.
And there's no
So
restrictions. They don't lose that housing allowance if they purchase
there's
a property.
nope, they do not. There's
No.
actually, and after this, I'll email you. There's a website. It's a military website where you can actually go in and put their years of service. If they're an officer 5, enlisted 4, whatever their current service is, you put it in there.
Mm-hmm.
You put the zip code, and it'll print it up for you, and you match it straight to their LES, which is a useful tool too if they're transferring somewhere right after
Yes.
the close of our loan, because you want to see what their new housing allowance is going to be.
Based on their area of the country, right?
Absolutely.
We've had a lot of people move from California to Texas, and it's a little bit less in Texas than it is in California.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Right.
I can
Or
see
if you do vice versa, if it's going to be higher where they move, you want to give them that
right.
increased amount.
Now, as from an underwriter perspective, are you giving that to them right away, or do they have to have something in hand from their new base?
As long as I
Like,
have their transfer orders, I'm good. And then I'll go look up the figures on that website.
okay.
Yeah,
So
so I
if
don't
you're a
require
veteran
the
or if you're
LES.
active duty out there and you're living on base, it might be something to consider is
Mhm.
using your housing allowance to maybe qualify for a home loan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So timelines, are underwriting timelines for a VA any different than a conventional or an FHA loan?
No, not at all.
Is there
They're
any
same
reason why
turn
people
times.
out there think there might be? Does it need to go to somebody else to look at the file? Does it, tell me how that looks.
No, I mean, it's the same exact process. Nobody else is looking at your files. I have probably more authority on VA loans than I do on conventional loans, as far as making those decisions for the higher DTI, because VA lays out compensating factors. And as long as I have one of those to throw in there, then, we're good to go. I don't need to
Right.
send it to somebody else like I would on a conventional.
Because it goes back to what? You have VA approval authority, right? You can
Absolutely.
do it and not have to worry about it. So, if you think it's going
Absolutely.
to take longer than, my quickest VA loan outside of a Streamlines have been about 12 days.
So
And
I did a joint loan that had to go to VA for prior approval because it was a veteran and non-veteran. We closed that loan in 21 days with it going to VA for prior approval.
so you bring up a good point. So with VA, you can do a joint loan. A lot of people may or
Mm-hmm.
may not know that, but you can do a joint loan. It does have an extra step where it has to go to VA, but I think VA's made that a little easier now with the
They
electronic
have.
version of what they will want to review, correct?
Absolutely. You just put it in stacking order, you upload it, and they review it, and they get back to you pretty quickly.
But with that being said, you're not going to get nothing down on that, right? Because if you have one veteran that has entitlement and one that does not, you're not going to get all of it covered. They're going to have to put something down, right?
Yeah. So there are different ways of doing what they consider joint loans. So joint loans are basically more than one borrower and they're not married. So it could be a veteran and a veteran, which if it is a veteran and you're using 50% of veteran A's entitlement and 50% of veteran B's entitlement, you don't have to send those to VA for prior approval anymore.
Oh, okay.
Which is,
That's good to
yeah.
know.
And I don't think a lot of people realize that, but because you're using both of their entitlements. So we as VA underwriters should be able to determine if there's enough entitlement. So that's one way, which is 0% down because they're using both entitlement. They both have to certify they're living in the property. That's the easiest way. The other one is veteran and non-veteran. So the easiest way for me to explain it is if you have a $500,000 purchase price, you divide that in two. So that's exactly how VA looks at it. $250,000 is the veteran, $250,000 is the non-veteran. They are only going to guarantee 25% on the veteran's half of that, which means the second borrower is going to have to come in with 12.5% down payment.
Right. No matter what.
So no matter what. So if they're going to come in with a down payment regardless, that's at least that high and they're going to go conventional, but one of them's a veteran and VA's rate is lower, you might as well do VA if they were already planning on putting that much down.
Right. Yeah. And that's, in the past, we've heard too from realtors, they can't do a VA home loan together because they're not married. Now we got to go conventional.
Yeah,
or we got to do a different type of financing. And that's, they don't know what they don't know. So that comes into play more often. That I've had a lot come across my desk here in the last 6 months asking those particular questions, but they didn't have the money to put down to do it that way.
Right.
But yeah, that is an option if you're out there and you have someone that you're not married to that's not a veteran, you can still make that work.
What I've done a lot where, they're active duty and they're serving together and they want to buy houses. So you have two non-married veterans that you're like, hey, let's buy a house. We still have how many years left let's do an investment together. And again, you can still do the 100% financing. It does not have to go to VA because they're both
Doesn't
veterans.
VA have something in there about if they intend to take title together as married that they don't necessarily have to be married? Or do you need that marriage certificate?
I don't ever ask for a marriage certificate. If they say they're married, they're married. That's they're
Right.
signing their loan application stating that. But you can do domestic partnerships. And then in that case, I think there's a certificate of domestic partnership. And
Okay.
that can be male, female, same sex. It doesn't matter. That just depends on the state, how they look at that. Some people don't want to get married, but they've been together for 10 years and they still want those benefits. So they do the domestic partnership.
Okay.
And they would only want proof of that. But
yeah, I had one loan where they wanted the engagement letter. I mean, luckily I had that, but I was kind of questioning, well, why do you need that? And they gave me a reason why. So I provided what they wanted and it ended up getting done. So let me ask you this last question.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was an interesting one. What tips or advice could you give to potential buyers out there that would help streamline the process and make things a lot smoother? What do you like to see in the file?
Do not buy anything. Do not move your money if you're using assets. That's the one thing about VA that people don't realize. Like, I don't need your bank statements. If you have enough seller credit, it's 100% financing. I don't need to see your bank statements. So sometimes less is more. Make sure your loan officer has everything that they need. Your loan officer to us, sometimes less is more. Have that conversation. You have to have the full story. If you had a couple hiccups in your credit, tell your loan officer what happened. There's ways around it. There's ways to explain it. You don't have to always pay off those collections, so don't think you have to. And then one thing, I have a family of veterans, so I actually had my nephew do this. I believe it is Experian or Equifax. Go in there and add your utilities. If you have little to no credit or your score needs a little help, go check out these credit bureaus. Do your self-reporting utilities. It's going to increase your credit score. It's 100% okay on any type of loan. Yeah. And it will be in your favor.
That's, I think, what Experian Boost does that, right? That's that process?
Yes, that's what it is. Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the day, sometimes less is more, but loan officers need to have all their ducks in a row from the client. Complete story.
Absolutely.
All the documentation to back up that story, and any things that might need another look at the guidelines when you're structuring that loan.
Absolutely. And if you do, having a great relationship with your underwriters is key to me. I always make myself available to my loan officers, and I'm always like, call me. If you are not exactly sure how to structure this or if this is okay, call me. We'll walk through it together, and I'll tell you, as far as VA goes, how to handle it.
Yeah, that's a big tool to have is that communication with the underwriter. I tell everybody this, I'm a big due diligence kind of loan officer. So I'll get the full story. I'll get all the documentation. And then if there's something in the guidelines that could go either way, I'm picking up the phone and talking that through and making sure that if there's something in addition that I might need to make the file stronger, or like you said, less is more, to make that file go through smoother. So it's key to have that relationship with your underwriters in general, not just the VA underwriter, but all your underwriters. Because what's cool about the business is each scenario, each customer has a different story. And that application, loan application, tells that story.
Absolutely. There was one, if you have children and the big difference between VA and conventional, and you pay child care, you have to let your loan officer know, because we do take that into consideration with your debt to income ratio. And a lot of times.
Is it income ratio or is it income or just residual?
It is both.
Both. Okay.
So there is a box that I think it's other liability, and it goes under job related liabilities, and you throw in the child care there.
What's the cutoff though for the child care? Is it 12 years old? 13?
I believe so. And so, yeah, so you could say I have two dependents. They're overage. They don't need
Yeah.
childcare. Like
At a certain age, they don't need the child care. So don't be concerned if they're at a
right.
certain age.
But I mean, if
But
you
you
have
still
a
have to
1 month
disclose you
old and
have.
you both dependents for residual.
Yes. Okay. And
Yep.
my last question is, you've got a ton of information. You've given us a lot of cool things to think about. Hopefully it's helpful to those that are going to listen to this podcast, but from your eyes, can you think of any success stories or any loans that got approved, manual, automated, that put a smile on your face?
I actually had one. It was a veteran and his wife. He was retiring. They wanted to keep the house that they had as like a second home. And they were probably going to Airbnb it to make some money off of it when they weren't there. But you can't use that for qualifying. And they were moving to where their kids and their grandkids were, and they just didn't have enough income for DU to like the file, and the DTI was a little bit too high for me comfortably to do a manual underwrite. So they were going to take out money from their 401k and put a down payment. The loan officer ran it that way, and it worked. But they were depleting almost all of their 401k. And I just said, whoa, wait a minute. We know that they can afford this. Why are they depleting their 401k just to get AUS approval? Let's set up a draw. They are of age. I'm like, ask them if they are comfortable setting up a draw. All I need is documentation showing they have sufficient funds in there for 3-year continuance, how much it will be a month, and when it'll start. And, they didn't realize that you could do that like you can on conventional. They thought they had to have a history of it. And so
Yep.
I saved them by depleting their 401k, setting up that draw. And, they have the continuance. They can stop it whenever they want. And the veteran was super thankful and happy that they did not have to take that money from their 401k.
That brings up a good point. So I do VA classes to realtors, whoever wants to listen. I'll try and do a class once a month. But in my presentation, I have this one quote that's in the VA guides. I'm going to read it. It says, underwriters are encouraged to consider to every possible appropriate factor in seeking a proper basis for approving loan applications for every qualified veteran. And you just gave an example of how that happens. So if you're listening out there and you're saying that VA home loans are hard to get approved through underwriting, they take longer, that is not the case. We have a
absolutely
clear example of that not happening. So that's awesome. Is there anything that you would like to add before we end? This has been so cool having you on.
I would say the only thing is, if you have properties that are on a private well, just order that water quality test. A lot of people think that you need an actual well test. You don't. We just need the water quality test. Get it ordered. Don't wait for the last minute. You know what's required. So just get it so it's already there.
100%. I had one last month where we didn't know that till we got the appraisal that was on a water well, which,
wow.
As good as I am, I failed to ask that question, even though I knew it was rural. So when you've got a lot of things as originators going on with everything that we have to do and all the things that we have to do, sometimes things get overlooked. But yeah,
absolutely.
You're absolutely right.
As an underwriter, I always try to pull up the listing or the property, because sometimes it'll say, not always, but especially if it's in rural. And if I see it, I'll put it on my initial approval.
Yeah.
Just in case people aren't aware, because sometimes we don't know either until we get that appraisal.
Yep. It does make life easy. When we get a good underwrite, we get a good underwriter for any type of financing, VA in particular, because we're trying to get the veteran or active duty member in that house as quickly as possible, because it can make a huge difference just with what a veteran's gone through getting into a home.
Absolutely.
I can't even fathom what veterans go through when they come back home. But at the end of the day, having a secure home to have their family in is a huge, huge difference in moving forward.
Right. And
in civilian life.
They can buy a home when they're overseas. They don't have to, wherever their home is, wherever, when they're here, they could be overseas even for a year and they can still buy a home. Even if they're not married, they don't have to. That's one of the very few cases where they don't have to physically live in the home when they purchase it, if they are active duty and overseas. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. They think that you either have to be married or have a dependent that will occupy that property for you. And that's not the case.
As long as you have the intent to occupy, right?
Absolutely. And that's, how nice would that be for them to have a home to come to when they get back?
Absolutely. Well, this is great information. Again, I wish I could have you on for another hour and do another conversation about VA. There's just so much different. There's so many differences between the 2-3 products that it's huge. It's just night and day. So if you're out there listening, we thank you. We thank you, Jami Kennedy, again, our VA underwriter that we've used many times. If you have any questions, there's going to be some links on this podcast that Jami has provided us with additional resource information about the VA home loan. And if you have any comments below, please reach out and we'll get back with you as soon as we can. But again, Jami, we thank you, and that's a wrap. If this episode has been beneficial, we'd love to hear from you. Please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Also, for regular updates and tips, make sure to follow our social media channels, which you can find in the show notes. Until our next episode, keep making homeownership dreams come true.